Hello, everybody. This is part 5 with Michael Thompson. You saw his part 1 where he served 45 years in the California state prison system, was shot 22 times. The stories were absolutely epic, but he is in an activist mission as well, helping the fellas who are still inside, campaigning for prison reform and the end of this ridiculous mass incarceration system that they've got over there in California that's spawned all over the world now, with the UK having the highest incarceration rate in Europe following America. So we have announced that today's is a questions and answer session. So many people are interested in Michael's story. Thank you to all the people who have sent questions in advance. We've got tons of them here. And if you do have a question, please put it in the live chat wherever you are. So I'll work my way down the advanced questions, pull questions in from the chat, and we will go from there. We usually go for about 2 hours with these. Depends on your questions. And huge thank you to Michael for coming back on so many times, man. You've been really generous with your time. And
it's been my pleasure, actually.
Cheers. All right. So the first question then is from Keith Fawkes Hicks. What's it like, or what was it like being a leader of a hardcore group of men? How did you lead with such people that had the same mindsets? And how many times have you been targeted for assassination for being on the top? So we'll do this in 3 then. So what's it like being a leader of a hardcore group of men?
Well, ultimately, it's about power. And that's the whole idea behind any leadership in any organized crime organization. It's about power. It's about establishing a power base, and then what you do with that power. In order to stay on top, you've got to keep your wits about you. It's really a holistic approach, and that's the approach that I've always taken, is, to keep myself physically fit and, make sure that I'm getting plenty of sleep, but it also affects your resources, so that in that leadership role, I have a number of resources available to me throughout the prison. That could be the guards, that could be stable of prostitutes, that are feeding me information from their clients or their clientele. Individuals that I have strategically placed in jobs throughout the prison, clerks that work for captain, that is come across information, that feed that information, movement within the facility itself. I mean, there's a number of variables there, but in those variables, there are standards, and I've just mentioned some of those. So it can be daunting, no question about that, because you have a number of personalities that you have to deal with, not only within your own organization, but in other organizations. So, to the extent possible, you want to keep the peace, but by the same token, your currency is violence. So it's the projection of that and ensuring that that's not a false projection. And that's about it as it relates to that element of what it's like to be a leader. I think it's like any other business, really. If you'll just take any business structure that has a chief executive officer or manager or whatever it may be, and then, as it relates to the business, they're controlling their resources, their inventory, their marketing, their public relations, their employee base, as it relates to what's going on there, benefits, and so on. So it's just not really that much different in prison.
So the other part of this question then was, how do you lead when people have the same mindsets?
I'm not sure that I understand the question. How do you lead when people have the same mindset?
Yeah, how do you lead with such people who have the same mindsets? I think what it means is, because a leadership role is a dominant role, and these other fellows that you're leading are dominant fellows, how do you dominate the dominant fellows to lead them?
Yeah, it's typically referred to as an alpha male characteristic, and I've always been an alpha male and continue to be an alpha male. But oftentimes people misconstrue what that means. Excuse me. In the context of prison, um, it means one, not projecting yourself to be anything that you're not, so that whenever you're called upon, based on the projection that you're actually giving, that you're able to produce. So there's, and of course, the key to leadership is to produce. You have to produce results relative to revenues that you're generating, so that if you're generating revenues and everybody's living large in the way that they want to, and structure is going the way that it needs to go, everyone is taken care of within the prison setting itself, that there's adequate communications between the different prisons, and that you have associates on the street that are going from prison to prison, making contact, or open line of communication, so that everyone knows what's going on. And oftentimes the presumption is that everyone is an alpha male, and that's not necessarily the case. The objection is that, and too often I think the presumption is made that if a person possesses a given degree of physical prowess, that they're alpha male. Not necessarily so. Like everything else, I think, in life, an alpha male characteristic is a balance. In my case, a fourfold balance. That the biological, physiological, that psychological, sociological, and spiritual element that come together in balance to create the whole. The idea is not to resolve everything with violence, but to open up lines of communication. And communication is key in any relationship amongst your peers, your own members, and then, of course, those that may be rival gangs, among staff. So it's the ability to communicate and articulate yourself in such a way that you're communicating and being understood in that. So, some people possess extraordinary abilities, particularly when it comes to physical prowess, but they're unable to communicate. They're unable to provide leadership or direction, to make decisions, oftentimes split decisions in the second decisions. And that's important. So it's a combination of those things. So whereas you're dealing with individuals who are of the same mindset, they may not have the same skill set that you have and employ. So it's all those factors coming together in balance.
And then the last part of Keith's question was, how many times were you targeted for assassination?
Well, I don't know that I could measure that. I would just say quite a few. When you hold a position of leadership, then you're opposing forces, whether that be guards, a law enforcement in general, a rival gang, or just the regs on the line that that want them up themselves to circumvent the rules that are in place relative to, say, drug dealing or prostitution or extortion or anything else. So you're constantly targeted, not necessarily within your own organization, but more so with rival gangs, and staff are attempting to utilize their own modalities by way of propaganda, inserting rumor to place an individual at question with others. And if you allow, for instance, your membership to use methamphetamine, that methamphetamine typically turns to paranoia, and that paranoia sparks challenge, because too often what's happening is they're seeing something that really isn't there. So in order to not allow that to happen, what you do, you outlaw drugs, you outlaw the use of methamphetamines. So, that goes back to that holistic perspective. It's like any business where you have the introduction of a mind-altering substance, whether it be alcohol or drugs or whatever it may be, and then that has an impact upon your membership and their functionality and their ability to do what needs to be. You monitor all those things closely. And going back to the last part of the question itself, insofar as how many times have I been targeted? That's a daily basis, depending on where I'm. There's influx like the tides, so it's constant.
Michael, I'm getting messages coming in saying you're freezing a little bit here and there, and I have been seeing it as well at my end. Is there any way to strengthen your internet signal where you are?
That's the problem. Yeah, that's the problem we've been having today. I mean, the internet went out earlier today. We had a power outage, and we're right. We're kind of set in a valley surrounded by mountains, and weather that's right now. I mean, I just came out of a situation where power was out for 4 hours, and finally came back on. And in that case, I had a backup generator. Here, I don't have that, unfortunately. So the problem that we have is the fluctuation in the internet signal itself. There are a lot of towers around here, but unfortunately, they're not. The signal strength is not that great right now.
Okay, let's keep going then and see if it improves. Is there any other devices in the house that could be turned off so you have more internet strength in your own device?
Yeah, I have everything turned off. This is the only thing that's on.
Okay, let's see how it goes then. All right, so Doc Holiday wants to know, how long did it take you to get reacquainted with being free?
Well, I'm undergoing that process. Reacquainting is an interesting term. I mean, I understand the question, but it's more reacclimating to what exists today as opposed to what exists. I went to prison, when I was 22 years old. That was 50 years ago. So I'm in my early 70s now. So a lot of things have changed, primarily technology. I mean, we were just talking about the internet, and that didn't exist at all. But it's more than that. There are more people. The attitudes of people are different. Socialization is different. Of course, you have social media, which serves most of what occurs by way of social interaction now. And that's somewhat new. I don't have access to the internet. The only reason I'm sitting here today live is because I have a studio engineer, third party, that facilitates this for me. I'm prohibited by the courts right now from accessing the internet. So that makes things difficult. My access to government, for instance, Social Security, whatever it may be, is through snail mail. And, that takes weeks, sometimes months. So I'm somewhat accustomed to that. But the biggest obstacle, I suppose, the hurdle, was when I was released, like I went down to get my driver's license, for instance. And every government agency that I went to acquire identification and otherwise had me in the system as deceased. So first I had to prove that I was actually still alive. And so I had to go be fingerprinted, and then they ran that fingerprints through their database and determined that, okay, you are alive. Then it was a matter of reestablishing all my identity, from driver's license to Social Security card, everything. In the system itself, I was deceased. So once I established that, and I still run across that problem from time to time, when I attempt to purchase something, say with a credit card or a debit card, or do any kind of banking, oftentimes the hurdles are astronomical. But, and I suppose the biggest problem that I still deal with is sensory overload. So that's sounds, sights, just that senses itself. What I hear, what I see, what I smell, characteristics, associated with that. And that continues to this day. So that's why I'm off mountains. I'm grew up in the mountains. I'm familiar with the mountains, the tree people, the rock people. Everything's pretty much the same. They've just gotten a little bit bigger. But it's people in general that have changed. Demeanor, attitude, behavior, aggressiveness. I mean, just a multitude of factors there that actually kind of surprised me. Lack of manners, where I come from, a lot of the things that occur today didn't occur. And it was just, it was considered poor manners. And so I find that a lot.
Jen Hopkins has asked, I have a question for Michael, if you wouldn't mind. What was it like to be with a lady after 45 years in prison?
Well, that'll set you free. I mean, just simply stated, it's one thing to be liberated from incarceration, to no longer have to live in a cage, but the intimacy that comes with being with a woman is something entirely different. The best way to explain it perhaps is an awakening. So it brings everything that was essentially dormant back into play for 40 years, particularly as it relates to your senses and everything associated with that. But the very idea of intimacy on that level is indescribable. And that's the main thing, is the intimacy. It's not just about sex. It's the intimacy itself. That idea of being with an individual that is of the opposite sex, and everything that means in that interaction, in that relationship. I'm a great fan of intimacy on a number of levels, but it's really about relationship. So it's... you would think that it could be overwhelming. I did not find it to be that. I found it to be really intoxicating, and still find it that way.
Fantastic. Paul Stansby has asked, were you making drugs in-house, or were they being smuggled in? And if they were being smuggled in, were the guards smuggling them in?
In part, yeah, they were being smuggled in. You don't typically make drugs in-house. You don't have the means to do that. About the only thing that is made in-house is alcohol. And so we had, for instance, 2 stills at Old Folsom. So you make your base, depending on what you're making, whether it's Raisin Jack or whatever it may be, then you distill that, and then you can double distill it. And that increases your alcohol content in that. But insofar as other substances, that's imported. And, there are a number of ways to bring that in. It can be brought in through visiting, but any kind of quantity is typically muled in by staff. So you want to remember that back in the 70s, the guards union was not very well established, and they were making just a little more than minimum wage. So that if you offered a guard, say, $10,000 to bring in one shipment of, say, methamphetamine, that was actually more than half of what he was making in 6 months. And so, the war back then wasn't making that much money. So if you offered him $50,000 to allow these activities to occur, and then you were paying your mules $10,000 for each shipment, they were making pretty good money. And the turnover on that was fairly large. It depended on how much if you stepped on it, how much you stepped on it, and of course the product itself, whether it was tar heroin or methamphetamine black. Back then, the methamphetamine is different than it is today, and is primarily made by the Hells Angels or offshoots of the Hells Angels. They had a number of expert cookers, and so that would be smuggled in, and then usually the Mexican mafia had a handle and monopoly on black tar heroin that would come in from Mexico. But you also had cocaine, But that's cocaine. Depending on the time factor we're talking about here, typically doesn't last long enough and isn't as intense as your standard, what we used to call water, which is methamphetamine. And then, of course, you had marijuana, but your marijuana wasn't anywhere near as strong in THC as it is today. You're talking about strains now that produce 30% THC in their particular variety. And of course, now you have that which is psychological and that which has a bodily effect. And you can choose between the two. And then, of course, your CBDs and everything else that goes along with that. So back then, you had Oaxacan, you had Maui Wowie out of Hawaii, you had Colombian, which was, a fair weed. But usually those three to choose from. You had some hashish, you had blonde ladies, and insofar as potency, that was probably top of the line. So, and that would dictate your cost margin. And so anything was available. You had your psychedelics, your hallucinogenics, and that ran from mushrooms to LSD, lysergic acid, mescaline, and that was typically about it. Of course, you always had huffers, and huffers would essentially use anything that acetylene, whatever it may be, but that was as common. And then, of course, your alcohol.
So we've got John M. Why did they choose you to be part of a 3-man commission over the other members?
Well, that was to provide really infrastructure. Prior to that process taking place, it was one man, one vote, so that if you wanted to bring a new member in, every member had a vote relative to that. And but a lot of the revenues that were being generated by the brand at that time were being used to support the addiction of the membership. So you had literally tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars going into the arms or bloodstream at any rate of members, their associates, and otherwise. So the idea here was to restructure the organization along the lines of business, along the lines of really organized crime, where you have commodities that you're selling, that you're in business to sell, you're generating revenues, you're turning those revenues back over and reinvesting that as you would any good investment toward the principal. Principal being the organization itself and its infrastructure by way of business enterprises in the street that were legitimate. So it was really just that. It was to provide a business type infrastructure to the organization so that it could more fully realize its potential as a business entity within the organized crime community.
Michael Benson has asked if there's anything you miss from prison life.
Wow, what a great question. And I say that because it's not one that you usually hear. No one would actually think that you would miss something. But the thing I do miss is, we had, for 25 years, I held the people's pipe behind the iron gates. I had that privilege. And I was a part of every Native American circle in every prison that I was ever in. And so we had built sweat lodges and we had ceremony and we participated in those ceremonies every day, and usually had a sweat once a week. And so, yeah, if I miss anything, it's the ability and opportunity to serve my way of life and my relationships that I shared in that through that way of life from the sweat lodge and with the brothers that were there. And I do miss that.
Question from Damien Crombie about the future of the ABN prison gangs. If you were imprisoned today at the same age you were imprisoned in 73, would you have made it and survived?
Oh, no question about it. It's the prison system today is pretty soft by comparison. And that's because you have a lot more prisons. The training on the part of the guards is far more advanced. You have technology available today that was not available back then. So that, cell phones are readily available within prison, and all the technology that comes with that by way of communications and interaction. So there's a greater degree of sophistication available within the prison system, but there's also on the other side of that, that same technology available to law enforcement. They do use it. And then, of course, the physical structure is entirely different. You have different designs in prisons. You have what's called a 180 design. You have a 270 design. You have an open design. And it's how you interact within that. With so many prisons, you have smaller populations. And then you have different levels of classifications of custody now. So you go from a level 1 to a level 4. If you go into a level 4 prison, then your life is going to be much more difficult because it's far more intense at that level. And that's usually predicated upon the nature of the crime on the part of the prisoners that live there. For the most part, they're lifers. And if there's gang activity, which there usually is at that level, then you're going to be subject to that. You go down to a level 3, it lessens. You go down to a level 2, you have more programs available to you. You have education, vocation, and otherwise. So, no, going into the system today would be far more different and I think much easier.
Stephen wants to know, what is your take on us versus them? It's become inmate versus inmate more and more.
Yeah, it has, and that's unfortunate. Ideally, what I'd like to see is a greater level of unity amongst the prisoners and the populations. That's just really a matter of what your focus is. It's become, us against us because of the scarcity of resources. I just mentioned the new infrastructure on the part of the prisons, more prisons. And so it's really a more controlled environment. And as such, there's a scarcity of resources. And so the hustle actually becomes more intense. And it's like anything else. It's just like the gangs on the street. What they're seeking is territory. So you'll have a lot of so-called cars within a prison setting. And so that if more times than not, you have gangs that are dominant there, they'll utilize those cars in some capacity. And that even creates a greater sense of scarcity for what's called the reg. So his life is pretty much dictated by that scarcity. And but it's to really render it down as it relates to that us against us dynamic. And the reason you have that now so ever before is because of the competition as opposed to cooperation. If there was a mechanism in place to facilitate a greater degree of cooperation amongst the populations, then you wouldn't have that. And there's a certain psychology that goes along with that. Guards, for instance, have learned through their own training at the academy how to utilize information against the inmate population. So they'll feed the population rumors, and this is happening over here. So they'll keep them at odds with each other more so than they used to through their own methods of gathering intelligence and using their resources, their informants, what we call conduits. They have conduits that they use to disseminate disinformation to the population that creates anxiety, generates anxiety, creates strife. And so you'll see people at odds with each other as a result of paranoia. And there's more of that today. You want to remember that the gangs really were just recently reintroduced to the general populations within the prisons when they shut down the security housing units at Pelican Bay, Corcoran, HP, a few other places. So now that you have the gang leadership and members back on the main lines, you'll see a change in that us against us dynamic, because the gangs are looking to do business. And in doing business, they need to provide an atmosphere that is conducive to conducting business. And so you'll see that us against us begin to fade away in the next decade. Interestingly enough, it takes that long. Usually things within the joint, they take about a decade. And so with the gangs now back out on the lines, you'll see that change occurring, and it's already occurring.
Okay, Michael. So it's been freeze framing the whole time then for this 30 minutes. Do you think that? Yeah. Do you think we should? Because there's tons of questions coming. It could go for a very long time. Do you think we should wait until things settle down at your end with the power and the Wi-Fi and stuff, and come back when it's better?
I do. I think that's just the intelligent thing to do, and we can start all over. And of course, we appreciate the patience of everybody in this, but we want to produce a quality program. That's the idea here. And to my way of thinking, be irritable, make it irritable to have to. What's he saying? What's that mean? I missed that. And I would be that way. So I think the prudent thing here to do is to go ahead and shut it down and come back at a later time and pick it up. Why this is happening, the only thing I can attribute it to is the weather. With the power going out, that's a pretty good indication. And we had a hard freeze here, and that hard freeze usually plays with lines. I know we're dealing with the internet, so we're not dealing with lines here, but it still has an impact because we're talking about atmospheric conditions.
All right. Well, huge thank you to everyone who's tuned in tonight and sent your questions in. There's tons of them. We've got backlogged here. So what we'll do is we're going to end the stream now, because I know it must be frustrating for people when you can't hear everything. And I will coordinate with Michael a new time and date to relaunch this one. So please bear with us. Thank you for tuning in. Like I said, huge thank you to Michael for his time. And we will get something. We will get something up and advertised soon. So thanks for watching. Cheers.